So I'm Chris Peacock. A warm welcome to our celebratory event for Michele Moody-Adams' latest book, Making Space for Justice. We're going to be on a very tight timetable. Officially, this session ends at 7:30. We can run on a little bit, but to maximize time for substantive philosophical discussion, I will very briefly introduce our speakers. Michele Moody-Adams, who doesn't need an introduction because you're here and want to know about the book. Serena Kader is just walked in. Here she is. Thank you very much. From Brooklyn College, Sheila Benhabib, who is affiliated with our philosophy department, and Bob Gooding-Williams, who's well known to you too from our department, will also be commenting. As I say, I won't do a long introduction. Let's launch in straight away. Each of the main speakers has been asked to speak for just 8 minutes. We'll then give Michele 5 to 10 minutes, and then the discussion is open to the floor. Thank you very much, Michele.
So I want to start by thanking the Heyman Center staff, especially Eileen Galuli and Lindsay Schramm, for making this event happen, for making the book happen. I would like to thank the editorial team at Columbia Press, especially Wendy Lochner, who's here, Lowell Fry, and Joanne Raymond, and for the willingness of the panel to participate in the discussion of the book. I thank the distinguished philosophers at this table, Christopher Peacock, Serena Kader, Bob Gooding-Williams, and Sheila Benhabib. So I'll start talking a little bit about the book. So for much of the 20th century, social theorists presumed that collective action outside of conventional political institutions would almost always degenerate into collective irrationality. This presumption was not dispelled, even during the 1930s and 40s, by extensive nonviolent protests rooted in Gandhian satyagraha. The fear of irrationality was especially great when collective action was openly linked with anger. This is why Martin Luther King's 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, along with the movement it sought to defend, marks a critical turning point in history and in social thought. King was adamant in the letter that the demonstrations against segregation were rooted in righteous indignation. Quote, "There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair," end quote. Yet from 1955 to 1965, which is the classic phase of the civil rights movement, the movement displayed a degree of collective rationality that had rarely been seen. And in service of a moral duty to resist injustice wherever it exists, guided by a morally demanding methodology of nonviolence and openness to redemption and reconciliation. The movement combined collective rationality with moral aspiration in a way that few endeavors have ever accomplished. The civil rights movement is thus a pivotal episode in the larger story of social movements that led me to write Making Space for Justice. But it took several years for social and political theorists to acknowledge how much the civil rights movement actually changed the way we could think about social movements in general. In the late 1960s, John Rawls recognized that civil disobedience could have a corrective function in democracies facing partial compliance with demands of justice. In 1984, Michael Walzer observed that insofar as we can recognize moral progress, it's more a matter of workmanlike social criticism and political struggle than paradigm-shattering philosophical speculation. But the most significant acknowledgement of the meaning of the civil rights movement came in 1991, when two sociologists, Ron Eierman and Andrew Jameson, defended what they called a cognitive approach to social movements. For Eierman and Jameson, the civil rights movement actually helped to confirm that progressive social movements are essentially forms of cognitive praxis, that's their phrase, by which they meant temporary public spaces that allow collective creation of socially constructive ideas, identities, and ideals articulated through social criticism and put hopefully into practice in political struggle. And Making Space for Justice is an effort to build on this approach, to reveal the philosophical importance of insights produced by three kinds of movements: social reform movements that since 19th century abolitionism have sought to make democracies more just, democracy movements such as the Velvet Revolution in the 20th century and the Arab Spring in the 21st that have sought to transform authoritarian regimes into democracies, and finally, the global human rights movement as it emerges even before the end of World War II in Raphael Lemkin's work on the concept of genocide. And my argument is that these movements have generated insights about political life and its moral underpinnings, which deepen social understanding and enrich philosophical reflection. Relevant insights come to light in policy proposals and manifestos, autobiographies and participant essays, documentary and journalistic accounts, and of course, writings by movement intellectuals. Now, I stress that despite the centrality of the civil rights movement to the story that I tell in Making Space for Justice, a movement need not be guided by the methodology of nonviolence to qualify as a valuable site of cognitive praxis. One of the book's central examples is the movement against South African apartheid, whose best-known leader, Nelson Mandela, declared in his 1964 speech at the Rivonia trial that he was prepared to die to help create free, democratic, and non-racial South Africa. Of course, he eventually relinquished violent resistance to enable a peaceful transition to democracy, and Making Space for Justice frames his personal transition as an extraordinary expression of heroism and grace, and treats its practical expressions as powerful contributions to philosophical reflection about democratic ideas. Now, the book's philosophical methodology is mainly influenced by two traditions. Inspired by John Dewey's pragmatism, I defend philosophical humility in regard to social movement insights. Yet my Deweyan humility does not diminish my readiness to assert the objective validity of social movement insights about the nature of justice. But secondly, I also draw on the work of political theorists Iris Young and Judith Sklar to urge that we cannot understand justice without taking seriously the facts and the faces of injustice. This is why the book contains more historical details than one typically finds in contemporary political philosophy. So these details are especially important for the chapters that comprise part one, in which I analyze the contentious politics of social movements. I show that these projects provide invaluable insights into the obligations of conscientious citizenship, the special demands of democratic citizenship, the social norms and political values that produce stable democracies, and of course, the nature of social justice. And regarding justice, social movements show that treating people justly is treating them with humane regard. A project that combines robust respect for our status as rational agents with compassionate concern for our vulnerability to pain and suffering. And I show in the book that regrettably, it's the spectacular failures of humane regard that usually best illuminate its content and confirm its moral and political importance. Social movements also show that defensible accounts of how to produce humane regard in institutions must reject what's often called the distributive justice paradigm, defended extensively, for instance, by John Rawls, in favor of what Iris Young described as an enabling conception of justice. Humane regard is not a distributable benefit of social cooperation. Instead, it requires institutions and practices in which we're free from disabling constraints. That is, it demands institutions in which we're able to constructively exercise our capacities for choice and action without unwarranted interference, coercion, or violence, and through which we're able to live relatively free from unnecessary pain and suffering. The chapters that comprise part two discuss social movement insights regarding the role of imagination in political life. And some of these insights anticipate compelling arguments from thinkers like Benedict Anderson and Charles Taylor, for whom imagination is necessary to constitute and stabilize political communities. But social movements have also recognized the socially transformative power of imagination, and Making Space for Justice analyzes three varieties of activism drawing on this power. First, aesthetic activism, as in the challenges to stigmatizing monuments in summer 2020. Language activism, for instance, as in the emergence of the concept of sexual harassment. And narrative activism, as in, for instance, the writing and dissemination of 19th century slave narratives. So the final chapters in part three show that progressive movements succeed and the change they create is durable only when they harness the politically constructive power of collective hope. But a persistent challenge, as the philosopher Baruch Spinoza understood, is that societies can fluctuate dangerously between hope and fear. They can even be dominated by collective fear with destructive results. And the final chapters show how backlash movements, including contemporary varieties of xenophobic populism, actually try to garner support by rhetorically reframing ideas and policies rooted in fear and resentment as dangerous simulacra of hope. Yet the book concludes by considering a habit of mind that I call civic grace. Civic grace is capable of sustaining genuine collective hope, I show, despite great social upheavals. And I show, in fact, at the end, that the best evidence of the power of civic grace often appears in the courageous work of movement leaders such as Martin Luther King, Václav Havel, and Nelson Mandela. Thank you very much. Press the button. Okay, great. Okay. So first of all, thank you to Professor Moody-Adams for writing such a wonderful book, and to the Heyman Center for hosting us and all of the work that has happened to get us here. I'm a person who goes to an awful lot of protests. My younger child, who's a COVID baby, has never been to the inside of a restaurant, but he has been blocking traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge, watching his mom chant, "This is what democracy looks like." So part of what I love about making space for justice is that I think it is an erudite and really unassailable defense of the spirit of that chant. So if you are a person who finds yourself arguing with folks about why you're in the street or arguing on Twitter rather than writing to your congressperson, this book is for you. I want to do two different things in my comments. First, I just want to situate Moody-Adams' contribution in a conversation in philosophy she very briefly situates herself in, which is the movement for non-ideal theory. And then I want to raise three critical concerns, but concerns from a friend who is persuaded of the relevance and rationality of social movements for the maintenance of democracy. So first, let me say a little bit about Moody-Adams' contribution to the movement for non-ideal theory. Simply put, I think that Moody-Adams is offering a novel idea, that a novel argument that public reason itself is an idealization. Without going into too much detail about the Rawls, Rawls argues that in order to sustain a just society, we need to be in the practice of giving reasons to each other. Moody-Adams thinks of herself as kind of just criticizing Rawls's idea that the content of public reason that doesn't need to be shifted. I think of her as making a more radical critique, which is that actually what we are currently calling public reason is not public at all, that our existing reason-giving practices actually exclude some people or only partially include people into the status of needing to have reasons given to them. And if that's right, that's a novel understanding of why public reason is a problematic idealization, because most of the literature out there saying that public reason is an idealization focuses basically on individuals not being rational enough to practice public reason or not liberal enough to practice public reason. Moody-Adams has this beautiful reading of the phrase Black Lives Matter in the early parts of the book. And one of the things she says is this phrase is really not a phrase about the interests of Black Americans at all. It's a phrase calling for respect for equal standing. I think that's right, but I also think if that's right, if the current state of many oppressed and marginalized groups in the States is currently one where they lack equal standing as deliberators, then I think it has to follow from that public reason doesn't yet exist. In fact, it's something to be achieved and something that we have to work hard to try to get to and maintain, which I think fits nicely with like the Deweyan spirit of the book also. Okay, now on to my kind of critical-ish comments that, as I say, come from a friend who is also convinced of the value of social movements for democracy. First, I just wonder if the mechanism by which Moody-Adams takes social change to happen through movements is too cognitive.
So I see they're trying to prove that they're rational, but I wonder if maybe we went a little bit too far in that direction. So I have two kinds of counter examples in mind. One might be movements that focus on reorganizing physical space before they focus on changing hearts and minds. So I think arguably we can think about the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa as originally taking that kind of form, as saying we need to be allowed to work here, move here, go here, rather than change the way you see us as persons. A second type of counterexample I have in mind is one that you kind of mentioned briefly, which is an idea developed by Cheshire Calhoun, which is the idea that social movements can engage in a type of moral vanguardism, where they develop moral understandings that are initially not totally accessible to the dominant group. And Calhoun says, when that happens, it may be appropriate to seek institutionalization of the movement's goals, maybe even before everybody is on page with the movement's goals. So to give kind of an example of that, we might think of a lot of practices around trans rights that have recently arisen that, for example, it maybe is not yet obvious to the mainstream of the United States that it's wrong to call a trans person by their pre-transition name. At the same time, we see academic journals, for example, creating practices that make it easy for people to change their name in the for articles that they wrote before their name change. This seems to me like another example of a case where the way that the movement affects social change is not necessarily through mechanisms of changing hearts and minds first, but rather through institutionalization and the cognitive change, if it happens later. So that's my first kind of critical concern. My second critical concern has to do with in-group, out-group dynamics and the discursive norms that contribute to what Moody-Adams calls humane regard. So one of the things I love in the book is that Moody-Adams pays attention to how important it is for social movements to create self-regard and hermeneutic resources for oppressed groups, right? Like, so feminists had to engage in consciousness raising to be able to name what was happening to them and then to be able to do something about it. But then there's something else she wants to say in the book, which I kind of read as a criticism of call out culture or something similar, that says humane regard for people in the mainstream or in the dominant group can be diminished by excessive focus on microaggressions and these kind of things. So I'm sympathetic to that worry, but at the same time, I just want to point out I often think the real purpose of call out culture is not necessarily to speak to the dominant group at all, but rather to build up epistemic resources and self-esteem for the oppressed group, right? So you may, the real point may be for the oppressed person to de-gaslight themselves and to say, well, that thing that the people in the dominant group think is not that big of a deal actually is a huge deal. That's why we're going to make a big deal of it amongst ourselves, and then other people might come along better later. So I just wondered if you had anything to say about that tension. And my last kind of critical question has to do with group-based oppression and how effective the enhancement of humane regard is as a tool for fighting against it. And you probably don't remember this, but you brought this up a bit during my talk when I was here last. So I think we may also have kind of a deeper philosophical difference about individualism. But basically, I am not totally convinced that it's lack of respect or empathy for individuals that's really at issue morally in cases of group-based oppression. And because of that, I'm also not totally convinced that enhancing humane regard always works as a tool against group-based oppression. And I'd like to give two further kind of quick reasons for that. One just comes from the literature on moral psychology there's a large literature on a phenomenon called psychic numbing. And I'm also introducing this because I love how empirical the book is. So I'm thinking like, let's introduce some other types of empirical data. But the literature on moral psychology says like, we think like philosophers want to think you form empathy for one person and that empathy scales up to having empathy for more people. But it seems like what the moral psych actually shows is that our psychic apparatus gets sort of overwhelmed and hijacked and turns our attention away from solving large-scale problems. So we get really focused on the suffering of the individual, but it doesn't translate into a desire to do something about the problem. It seems like it translates into a desire to make the bad feeling go away. The second sort of quick form reason that I have this worry about humane regard and group-based oppression comes more from my personal interest in transnational feminist organizing, and in particular, from the fact that I think we can identify in that type of organizing a lot of cases where humane regard is actually an alternative to recognizing structural problems and to solving that. So to give one super quick example, Sujatha Fernandez tells a story of how domestic worker movements worked in New York just 5 or 10 years ago. And she says, like, there were two narratives that were competing in the domestic worker organizing. Like, one that says the domestic worker has this cruel boss who abuses her, doesn't let her go to the bathroom, and so on. And the other narrative that says we as a society don't value this work because it's women's work and migrant work, and we need to subsidize the work. I don't want to take too much time going further into this, but I think you guys can guess which narrative won. The first narrative won. It resulted in this Bill of Rights that by the time it went through legal reconciliation didn't even contain paid sick days for domestic workers. And my concern here is also that sometimes humane regard can actually distract from structural problems, not just because of features of our psychic apparatus, but maybe also because of how it's less threatening or like susceptible to use through motivated reasoning for members of the dominant group or people who are benefiting from structural justice. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Thank you. So Michele Moody-Adams has written a particularly compelling book that is rich in philosophical insight, subtle in its argumentation, and it is important to add, beautifully written. Making Space for Justice is a pleasure to read and is certain to reward the engagement of philosophers and non-philosophers alike. Indeed, the engagement of any democratic citizen wishing to deepen their understanding of the contributions progressive social movements can make to promoting democratic ideals. To those of us who knew the late Iris Young and who have been inspired by her work, who also have been inspired by her work, it is similarly wonderful to see how throughout Making Space for Justice, Michele builds on and refines some of Iris's key insights, for example, her defense of inclusive political communication and her idea of an enabling conception of justice. And among philosophers involved in the epistemic turn in ongoing critical discussions of social movements and social protests, as in the work of Sally Haslanger and Jose Medina, for example, Michele's arguments for regarding social movements as forms of cognitive praxis will soon be regarded as indispensable additions to those discussions. As you've already heard, Michele kicked off this evening's celebration of her work with an excellent overview of the lines of thought that she develops in Making Space for Justice. For my part, I will concentrate on just a couple of those lines of thought, both stemming from the last third of the book entitled The Importance of Political Hope. First, I shall say a few words about Michele's engagement with Giorgio Agamben and Slavoj Zizek around the theme of hopelessness. In particular, I draw on the work of a contemporary philosopher, Tom McCarthy, to propose a supplement to Michele's arguments against Zizek and Agamben. Second, and again to supplement Michele's arguments, I suggest that we can regard W.E.B. Du Bois's critique of a particular strain of Civil War historiography as contributing to what Michele, following Maurice Mandelbaum, calls a pragmatics of history. On Michele's account, Zizek and Agamben alike believe that political hope in our times is intellectually indefensible. In addition, she attributes to Zizek the view that today true courage involves an admission of hopelessness. Regarding the second claim, Michele persuades that it is morally unconvincing. Regarding the first, again, that political hope in our times is intellectually indefensible, she is less persuasive. For Michele's rejoinders to Zizek and Agamben, that the practical consequences of adopting their theoretical posture will involve deadly and widespread violence in the guise of progress, as in the Reign of Terror and the excesses of Stalinism and the Khmer Rouge. That rejoinder, even if correct, omits to show that their theoretical posture as such is incorrect, or at least questionable. It seems to me, however, that again, to supplement Michele's argument, one might engage Zizek and Agamben on their own turf at least to the extent of sketching an account of what an intellectual or theoretical defense of political hope might look like. And here again, Thomas McCarthy's work is helpful. Inspired by Kant's idea of a universal history, McCarthy argues that moral politics demand, he says, reasonable hopes for practically feasible futures, hopes that are supported by basic patterns of development and tendencies of contemporary history. And moral politics demand reasonable hopes, he insists, for the political pursuit of social justice will make sense to us only if we have reason to believe that the just future that is the goal of our politics is a politically achievable goal. But what reason could we possibly have to believe this? The answer to this question McCarthy proposes is precisely the sort of reason we adduce when we construct plausible interpretations of persistent patterns and present tendencies of historical change, in light of which the just future to which our moral politics aspire can be said to be practically feasible. McCarthy conceptualizes these interpretations of historical change or development as grand narratives that, while providing practical orientation to moral politics, should not pretend to scientific objectivity. To be understood neither on the model of what we're calling Kant, McCarthy calls the massive determinate judgments available from empirical inquiry, nor as a version of philosophies of history that figure human history as the self-articulating movement of an abstract principle such as reason or freedom or civilization. Think of a certain version of Hegel. The sort of storytelling McCarthy endorses is a form of Kantian reflective judgment that must take account of and be compatible with known empirical data and causal connections, yet also go beyond those data and connections in presenting a reading of what is known that, though subject to contestation, is at once credible and able to warrant our moral political hopes. McCarthy gives a compelling account of the role that narrative can play in buttressing the hope that moral politics demands. In Michele's terms, he provides a framework for defending a sort of narrative activism that can be adduced to answer Zizek's and Agamben's skepticism as to the prospects for a theoretically and thus intellectually defensible endorsement of political hope. I turn finally to Michele's defense of a pragmatics of history, a concept she adduces to meet the objection that a politics too dependent on claims about historical injustice may risk encouraging politicized and partisan history. Against this worry, Michele rightly insists, I believe, that we have a moral interest in history that, when carefully articulated and adequately addressed, enables us to make use of history in political argument and moral reflection. Our moral interest, Michele suggests, is at least in part an interest in properly attributing moral praise and blame to past actors for their actions and motives. Michele helpfully invokes Annette Gordon-Reed's work on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings as an example of the sort of historiography she has in mind, but more philosophically, I think, could be said here, specifically as to the criteria that historiography that provides for the possibility of moral praise and blame has to satisfy. Here again, I suggest Du Bois provides a useful supplement to Michele's insight, for he explicitly criticizes histories that discuss slavery with moral impartiality, depicting America as helpless and the South as blameless, while explaining the war difference as a sort of working out of cosmic, social, and economic law. An example of this sort of history is Charles and Mary Beard's, he says, sweeping mechanistic interpretation of the Civil War, where there is no room for the real plot of the story, I'm quoting Du Bois here, for the clear mistake and guilt of rebuilding a new slavery of the working class in the midst of a fateful experiment in democracy, for the triumph of sheer moral courage and sacrifice in the abolition crusade, and for the hurt and struggle of degraded Black millions in their fight for freedom and their attempt to enter democracy. Can all this be omitted and half suppressed in a treatise that calls itself scientific, Du Bois asked. If history is to be a science of human action that gets at the real and thus moral plot of human events, then Du Bois believes it must take account of the subjective meanings of actions and of the subjective meanings of actions and events. He implies that the historian cannot truly tell the story of the mightiest effort of the mightiest century, the struggle of enslaved Blacks to achieve democracy, without taking account of the psychology of the agents whose actions sustained that effort. More generally, Du Bois insists that the historian of slavery asked, just what did slavery mean to the owner and the owned? Du Bois is a moral realist who believed that historical knowledge includes a knowledge of the moral worth of the motives that explain human action, thus not only the knowledge that such and such actions are right or wrong, but that the motives which explain those actions are morally blameworthy, or again, that they are morally praiseworthy. But to obtain that knowledge, historians must understand human action in terms of their subjective meanings, for they require some such understanding of human action to render intelligible their application of the vocabulary of moral evaluation. For Du Bois, a vocabulary that includes the language of guilt, of moral courage and sacrifice, and of the degraded black millions. Du Bois argues that a necessary condition of the possibility of acquiring knowledge of moral facts through the historian's practice of the science of human action is what Max Weber would have called a Verstehen-centered approach to that practice, an approach that explains human actions in terms of subjects, motives, or purposes. In sum, then, Du Bois provides fuel to Michel's moral realist or moral objectivist fire by making a case for the sort of historiography we require if, on moral realist or moral objectivist grounds, we wish to resist the charge of politicized and partisan historiography and still morally praise and blame historical actors and their motives. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you to Michele for inviting me to comment on this book, which I enjoyed and admired, and endorsing something that Bob said. It's beautifully written, and I think written in the spirit of the civic grace, which Michele advocates at the end of the book. And I do apologize, I have a very sore throat right now. The book is an original treatment of social movements, as we heard, not just as bearers of contentious politics, but also as initiating cognitive changes. And in evaluating the cognitive and moral changes, of course, brought about by social movements, Michele brings her philosophical training and inspiration in what I would call post-Wittgensteinian analytical philosophy, the work of Cavell, Charles Taylor, and Iris Young in particular to bear on these themes. The most original part of Michel's discussion are those bearing on language, narrative, and public art, what she calls linguistic, narrative, epistemic, and sympathetic imagination at work and in the service of transforming our identities, moral, cognitive, and aesthetic. First question, and this is going to lead to a friendly amendment. Michele mentions that social movements can also be regressive, but her paradigm example is the civil rights movement, and to a lesser extent, social reform movements such as the Velvet Revolution, the Arab Uprising, the global human rights movement, etc. My question is, what would be some criteria by which we would want to judge movements to be regressive or emancipatory? Bear with me now. Take a movement such as the Tea Party movement. They also aim at certain linguistic transformations by modeling themselves against the revolt of the colonists against the British. They reclaim the revolutionary legacy of the founding through this narrative. This legacy, in their eyes, has been lost because core American values, family, country, apple pie, have been lost to the liberal elites. Instead of family, we defend the rights of LGBTQ plus individuals. Instead of country, a cosmopolitan elitism has emerged, which looks down on middle America and its values. And instead of apple pie, we have vegan restaurants. Now, such movements as well engage in the linguistic and narrative resignification that Michele describes. So how do we distinguish between these two kinds of movements? One answer, which would follow from the book, is that these regressive movements do not exercise caring respect or humane regard for all humans, and thus they fail in terms of upholding substantive values. I think this is a plausible answer,
one which I would participate in, but since we are obnoxious philosophers, it raises the question of quaestio juris, that is justification. Michele does not delve into justificatory questions in this work, but assumes that we would all want to endorse these values. I do as well. But I want to suggest an argumentation strategy in order to distinguish among these movements, which comes from my more proceduralist communicative ethics position, and see if Michele would agree with this as a friendly amendment. Let me first use the legal theorist Robert Cover's terms to distinguish between jurisgenerative and jurispathic movements. Jurisgenerativity refers to the augmentation and enhancement of meaning through narrative, whereas jurispathic is a shutting down of processes of meaning creation and the subjugation of the power of narrative to the ever-impending threat of violence. Now, if we add a procedural dimension to Cover's insights, what we would say about regressive movements is something like this. A regressive movement reduces and restricts the circle of its addressees. Instead of augmenting the participants in the conversation, it limits them according to usually, but not exclusively, essentializing criteria. Only those who respect proper family and Christian values are included in our circle of conversation. Second, a regressive movement reduces the permissible topics of conversation. Whether my country is right or wrong will not be open to debate because it is my country. Whether or not marriage is only a holy sacrament between a man and a woman cannot be open to debate because marriage is a holy sacrament according to the Bible, period. A further aspect of such movements is that they block the challenge to the rules for setting the conversation, i.e. they challenge blocking authority, whether this is sacramental, national, personal, or traditional, historical. Thus, I would say they block reflexivity and create jurispathis by blocking the power of narrative resignifications, which are so important for Michele in her understanding of emancipatory movements. Hence, these three criteria, which are more procedural in terms of exclusion from conversation, exclusion of certain topics from the conversation, and blockages of reflexivity in questioning the rules of the conversation. I submit, maybe a helpful supplement. I wish to make two smaller observations. And this is the problem of hope that Bob has addressed, but I'm taking it in a different direction. In her discussion of hope in chapter 7, the empire of effect and the challenge of collective hope, Michele privileges what she calls the standard account and defines it as expectant desire, i.e. a stance that combines wanting or desiring something to happen or be true with thinking that it could really happen to be true. End of quote. In the rest of the chapter, she discusses Jonathan Leader's concept of radical hope and Martin Luther King's idea of infinite hope. But in all cases, she wants to eliminate the aura of agency. That is, that hope will be associated with a readiness in pursuit of the object of hope. But for the principle of hope, to use Ernst Bloch's famous phrase from his magisterial work, Das Prinzip Hoffnung, has a more subversive dimension. Hope in such accounts is paired not with fear, as in Michele's account, but with dread. With the dread that earthly misery and catastrophe would continue and that we are helpless to change it. And admit this comes from the Frankfurt School tradition, right? The principle of hope, therefore, stresses utopian agency that can disrupt the way things are. Hope is the expectation that things can be otherwise, radically otherwise, sometimes whether reasonable or not, And such hope may presuppose faith, in the beginnings that some form of political action that opens up new horizon is always possible. I'm not quite sure how my understanding of hope as the counterpart of dread may or may not be compatible with Martin Luther King's notion of infinite hope. It's a question that lingers in my mind. And I have already put enough on the table, but my final puzzle is that at several points, Michele is comfortable with the view that all art is propaganda. Pages 246 to 247. Why exactly is that? And, you know, art, to use a phrase that will be known well to many of you, is the transfiguration of the commonplace, as Arthur Danto argued. But why is this propaganda? It would seem to me that there would have to be some form of unjustified coercion, some form of a hidden agenda in the artwork in order to quote unquote manipulate cognitions and direct behavior. In the absence of establishing that, I would not want to endorse the view that art is propaganda. In conclusion, let me just emphasize how much I admire this book and how much I gained from it. Thank you for writing.
Wow. First of all, sorry, I want to thank all the commentators for extraordinary comments. And I'm going to ask if I can get the written versions in each case, so I can think even more deeply than I could possibly do now. You know, what I'll do is maybe take the comments in order, and I won't claim to get to every important point from the comments. On the comments that Professor Cater made, I really do agree that I am being even more radical in the challenge to the idea of public reason than maybe emerged in the book. I thought it was there. I've written about it in other places where I think I've been more explicit about this, that I do think that it doesn't yet exist. And it's a bit of an artifice, theoretically, in Rawls to suggest that it's just a matter, well, when you're not including some people, it's just we need to change the constitutional essentials and then we move forward. I think that's not enough. Absolutely. The cognitive worry, I understand the general source of that worry, but one of the things I want to resist is the idea that I'm saying that social movements work by fundamentally trying to change hearts and minds initially. Because I think that one of the main things they're trying to do, if you think of the aesthetic challenges that were emerging in the summer of 2020 globally, they were trying to reorganize physical space first. And they saw that as a necessary prelude to any other kind of change that might come, but also any other kind of refashioning of the social imaginary that might be possible. I'm not always comfortable with, but the tearing down, right? That to me it was critical to them to say, we can't have these monuments in place because this is a way of saying they have public honor. I actually think that's very important. And I don't think that project is cognitive. I do think the language and narrative activism activities are maybe more cognitive than some, but I think that doesn't reflect upon what's happening with the aesthetic challenges, that they in fact wouldn't work unless they were saying first get rid of it, right? It's like the people during the American Revolution or the start of the revolution basically want to tear down a statue of George III. That has to go first before any other kind of activism that's affecting the social imaginary can take place. On the moral vanguardism, I don't believe there is such a thing. I genuinely don't believe there are ever any new moral ideas. I do think moral inquiry is always interpretive and it's always interpreting. I don't have a set list. I mean, I in the past have tried to devise a list, but I think you end up offering an interpretation when you attempt to provide a list of all the moral values and virtues that we can be concerned about. And I guess I think that the real core of social activism that I'm describing is less about in fact, it's not about coming up with new concepts, but with new interpretations of existing concepts. And so I would hold to that as a worry. The humane regard and group-based oppression, maybe I'll put these together. Well, the call-out culture, this I do need, because I made a comment, and keep me on the straight and narrow. The call-out culture, one challenge with your worry, Serene, is that some of the people who are most vocal in expressing call-out culture are actually not members of the oppressed groups themselves. I can tell you about classrooms where there are people, if there's an African-American and a certain word comes out and they don't say anything, there are people who on their behalf believe they have to do it. And the African-American student would sometimes just want to move on and not call attention. So my worry is that the idea of call-out culture being defensible because it's a way for the group itself to reconstitute its self-understanding. I don't think it actually always works that way, or even very often. I don't want to be against the idea of group-based oppression being something that can be remedied only by the revaluation, if you will, of the group's standing. I don't think my view is individualistic, especially because I did put a great deal of focus on Henry Louis Gates' understanding of slave narratives as collective tales. And I would add one thing that I've come to talk about a lot more lately is the very important way in which, when the mother of Emmett Till decides how she's going to react to this brutal lynching of her 15-year-old son, she ends up representing the loss, not as a personal loss, but as a collective loss. She calls for tens of thousands. Some people suspect it was 100,000 who marched through to see the body. This was a collective loss. She presented it as an attack on African Americans and a need for collective struggle to reframe the way the culture thought about what it is to be African American. That's just the way I would argue that I've built the group, the status of the group being in question, I think, into the project. So then I want to talk about Bob's comments. Let's go with the idea of reasonable hope. And there's your comments are all so rich. I'm afraid I won't be able to get them all. I do very much value the comments you introduced from Tom McCarthy, and the relevance of the notion of reasonable hope in making arguments to maybe some people you like to enlist in the constructive struggle for social change. The problem is, to go back to what came up at the very end of Professor Benaviv's comments, it isn't only reasonable hope that is critical for social movements. It is this hope when there's no clear reason to hope that sustains the movement. If Václav Havel in jail, Martin Luther King in jail, Nelson Mandela, maybe in some ways the most prominent example of this. If you read Long Walk to Freedom, you'll understand he did not believe at certain points in the period of incarceration, he wasn't clear that he would ever get out and ever have it. And there's a kind of hope. That's that third, I call it positional hope. I think the King's infinite hope, and I even think Jonathan Lear's radical hope, but in a different way. They're all varieties of this hope where it's not dependent upon having good reasons for thinking what you do will make a difference. You just do it because it's the right thing to do. And Václav Havel actually has a version of that in there, also in his thought. And on the Kantian reflective judgment, and I'm going to wait because I'm not sure on the grand narrative that I understood. I might ask to come back to this. The moral interest in history, that I am very much in sympathy with what I took to be a friendly amendment from Du Bois, that we need a kind of history that doesn't aim at moral neutrality or impartiality in order to right the kinds of wrongs that have been actually based on bad history, incomplete history. I absolutely agree with you. Now, the one challenge is internal to his history itself. There would be a number of historians who would resist the idea that you could actually genuinely confidently claim knowledge of the motives of the agents you're describing? And if you can't claim knowledge of the motives, can you confidently always make the kinds of evaluative judgments? I think you can, but I mean, anytime someone attempts to criticize slavery, right, we're told, well, it was in keeping with the culture of the time, and so you can't hold them responsible. And there is, I think, any number of historians who would argue that that may not be easy to resist or to argue against, even though I think that kind of Verstehen, as you described it in the Weberian term, the central approach to history, I think it would be good. You know, I think if you don't mind, I'm going to wait on the grand narrative and Kantian reflection judgment. So Shayla, what a third wonderful commentary. I actually think that you and I don't disagree on what justifies the distinction I want to draw between, and even the theories that you enlisted in service of your argument, because I was trying to find the page, but you know, when you want to find something, you often can't. I do say that what distinguishes the Tea Party, for instance, from, you know, the civil rights movement is that they're contracting the circle of people who are due humane regard. And I don't say this additionally, there's no justification for that effort to contract. And that it's in fact expressing something more like a resentment or a fear of status loss. You talked about good old American values. I would say underneath that is a fear of status loss, that everything about the socially or the progressive social movements that they're resisting really is perceived as in fact a challenge to their status as, you know, politically dominant, culturally dominant, and so forth. So, and I even before I came, I was trying to making sure I had a sense of why I think the Tea Party is a social movement. But the difference between what they wanted to do and what the progressive movements wanted to do is to contract rather than expand the circle of people. And I think on no good grounds. That's what I would argue. And then finally, on hope. This is another, I find this so fascinating. I'm not always sure I know what dread is and why dread, if it were the kind of opposite of hope, why dread isn't just a species of fear that is just more intense than any other, than our familiar framings of fear. I suspect actually that what is moving, what's underwriting the great replacement narrative, that horrible global narrative about, you know, you will not replace them. I actually think that is a kind of dread, in part because the resistance is that if the narratives that are now recasting and reshaping the social imaginary of a lot of Western societies become accepted, it means that the people who were in power when the worst of the immoral oppression happens, they're afraid that they're going to have to be called to account for it. There's guilt. This is James Baldwin in several articles about, he talks about the white man's guilt. It's not a phrase I would necessarily use here, but the worry that they're kind of pushing, suppressing, resisting history. I think this is what's happening in 2022, right, is where we are, where the school districts are, you know, trying to suppress and censor the teaching of certain kinds of arguments about slavery. To my mind, I think it is dread. I think it's an intense kind of fear, and it's fear rooted in the thought that now we're going to have to be called to account for it, and what will happen to us if that's the case. That's why King, to my mind, I'll finish up, is so wonderful in that he's saying, look, I think in the end, the ideal is going to be something that opens up the possibility of redemption and then reconciliation, rather than, so we shame you into recognizing you did something wrong, but we're not trying to destroy you as a consequence of the shame. So I guess I would say, I think dread is just an intense kind of fear, and that in the end, it doesn't diminish the value of trying to find something that can resist the consequences people are drawn to when they act out of understand or evaluate social movements in the terms of fear or even dread.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so the floor is open. Please raise your hand if you want to. Comments, question? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful book. And I think my comments will be I mean, my question will be a little bit contiguous with something that Sir Cotter raised about reorganization of space. So I actually agree with you that in the book I took some of your contributions to suggest that especially in the case of the monuments, it's very important that the social movement, in order to direct attention to the contested, to something that we should contest, they need to first reorganize space. And I thought that was a very powerful insight. But I kept wondering, then does protests have to end on day 2 once the media gives attention to this moral problem? So part of how I read the book is it's a response to intellectual elites who say, okay, you protested, now go home. And in some parts of the book, I feel like you're saying, no, like social movements are ways of civic engagement. They are contributions to moral inquiry. But I think in emphasizing inquiry rather than persuasion, maybe you are also opening up a response from the intellectual elite that says, okay, our attention is directed now, join our task force, stop protesting, and let's try to solve this problem. And that solution never comes. It's a delay tactic by the elite. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Wow, you asked a question that actually has many layers, like a lot like the commentary that we just got. I'll say a couple of things about it. Part of what I want to say maybe is the big point is that in the end, the result of any form of activism that's drawing on the imagination, but all the other kinds as well, I think in the end should be something that ends up being dialogic, not a one-way persuading, here's the right thing. And that's part of it. In another context, I got asked whether I expected the Tea Party to sit down with, Black Lives Matter. Actually, in the longer term, that's exactly what I would want. And I would want it to be understood that there was nothing that the movement itself could say in advance that should foreclose new possibilities that they've not themselves imagined. So I don't think the protest should end on day 2. And I don't think that the satisfactory conclusion to the protest would be something that just come join our task force, because that's, of course, either just going to be one way. We have the ideas and the knowledge, you listen, or it will end in something that isn't really demanding a profound change and a profound internal rethinking on the part of both parties. In this, I confess, I'm very drawn to the King view about first of all, the kinds of activities you engage in. Are they open do they suggest an openness to this kind of reconciliation? I don't know that you can reconcile with everybody. I'm sure there's some members of some of the groups that we have in mind when we think xenophobic populism who wouldn't want to talk, but I actually don't believe it's all. And that is the hopeful side of this. But your question is very well taken.
I don't need to. Tech needs it. Okay. So you have this remark in the introduction that one of the things we can learn from social movements is something about the nature of justice. And I wasn't sure from the book exactly what it was. We went then actually about the nature of justice. And indeed, you said in your remarks just now, you made a very striking remark. I don't believe there are new moral ideas, you said. There's generally new interpretations of existing concepts. So maybe you'd like to clarify your position a little bit. Thanks.
Sure. When a group or an individual or a culture offers its interpretation and possibly a new one, it is telling us something more about the nature of justice. Moral concepts, I've been arguing actually for some time, are, using a phrase from Mark Platts, are semantically deep. So deep that no one culture or one philosopher or one religious tradition could ever give us the whole truth about morality. But we're able to get, we hope, part of the truth. And I think the social movement insight, as I call it, about justice being humane regard is a new interpretation of justice that increases our understanding of its nature. And the reason I say this, I think there is, the tendency is to focus on respect for agency, or to focus on concern for suffering. So you could think of a Kantian or a utilitarian contrast. But there are other versions of the kind of intellectual tug of war that I'm resisting, and I think social movements are resisting. And I think they're telling us something about the nature of justice. That leaves open the possibility that there may be something 10 years, 15 years down the road that we didn't know we needed to know about the nature of justice that isn't yet fully articulated in the social movement project. But I hope does that make sense? I genuinely think it's telling us about the nature because the interpretation is deeper and richer and captures more of what we want a theory of justice to do.
Yeah, I'm very happy with that idea for all sorts of reasons, but I'm not sure why we wouldn't say that these are new moral ideas. Why not?
Insofar as we can recognize it as an account of justice, on my view, it's not a new moral idea. The critical element of what I'm trying to get is that, in fact, when most social movements, feminism, that's why I mentioned Catherine McKinnon. Richard Rorty says at one point she couldn't really mean that feminism is the belief that women are human in truth, if not in social reality, but she meant it. She was asked in a hurry moment, at a kind of talk in a public setting, what is feminism really about? It's the belief that women are human beings in truth. That's a very familiar attitude for all of the paradigm shattering work that she does in legal theory, in changing the way we think about discrimination, and changing the way we think about what constitutes a human rights violation in global settings and more. It's really quite a very familiar project she's engaged in, which is trying to tell us something about a familiar concept, in effect calling us back. It's almost maybe, I don't want to say it in the kind of Kantian way, but it's calling us home to a way of talking about what justice is that in fact we all find familiar. One last comment. One of the reasons I became more convinced than ever that the social movement insight that I was articulating was correct. There are two features of the practice in general public life that are critical. During the Rodney King protests, it emerged, as this is 1993, that there were police memos circulating that said, don't worry about the violence against the people in this urban area because no humans were involved. And in fact, it became a kind of acronym, NHI, no humans involved. But the second one is that the one very important ground for success, which is of course an odd word in the case, but success in the prosecution against the people, against Derek Chauvin, who had murdered George Floyd, was that the prosecutor managed to convince the jury that George Floyd was human. And this is even said several times as the prosecutor kind of describing the framing of the strategy. He had agency and he wanted certain things to happen and he felt pain. And part of the challenge of the way police practices work is this need to kind of treat African-American males as superhuman, so they don't really feel pain. They feel pain and they have desires to make things happen that are constructive and rational in the world. And the power of that prosecution, I really was not confident that it would turn out the way it did, but my confidence actually became even sort of more multi-layered when I realized that what they had done is they had shown that he deserved humane regard, that he was being denied during that horrible, horrible encounter, the 9 minutes of the video. Yeah.
Bob, did you want to comment on this? You looked as if you were incipient remark.
Michele, like Chris, I was surprised by the idea that there are no new moral ideas. And you can predict how I'm going to. Sorry? Okay. Okay. Is it okay now? Yeah. Okay, good. So morality must have a long history, right? It must go back into the Paleolithic. And it must have started in ways that were completely ignorant of the forms of relationship that later developed. So there has been a moral project in which new moral ideas have emerged. Why should anybody think that it stops at some past point in history? Is there a past point that you could fix at which, as it were, all the moral ideas? And I mean, it seems to me to be much more sort of, I mean, it seems to me at most be open-minded about us, but modesty would seem to suggest that, we haven't, as it were, learned everything there is to learn.
Philip, I think you and I have had a version of this argument before. I genuinely believe it maybe is a kind of quasi-Chomskyan account that I would give, that there is a stock of moral concepts with which it's not that we're born, but we're born with the capacity to interpret them and understand them and apply them. I don't claim to have, I said before, a finite list. Earlier today, I was going back through all the things I'd written, trying to see if I'd ever offered a list, and I deliberately resisted it. I would argue that there is a list of values. I think it's a short list, about 4 or 5, but I won't list them here. And I think they're virtues that actually show whether our understanding of what the moral life demands of us would involve a set of virtues that express the importance of these values. There can be different ways of framing what's important about the fundamental values. But I don't claim to have any ability, the way even Chomsky can't prove that, a universal grammar is really there, right? But my assumption is so much about what moral argument looks like when we are able to argue with people, not just inside our own heads. Demands, or I think makes sense only on the assumption that we all have access to this very short list of concepts. Different cultures interpret them in different ways. Different historical eras might interpret them in different ways, and they might even argue about what the fundamental values really are and what the proper characterization of them is. And that's part of the interpretive project as well. But I don't claim to have some, insofar as we constitute a species, to my mind, one defining feature of being a member of that species is having access to this short list of moral concepts. I used to call it Socratic constructivism, and I realized later that it was just getting in the way. But I think, so people are nodding. My understanding is that, when Socrates talks to the slave Meno about, the Pythagorean theorem, nobody says he needs to prove that the ability to understand the theorem, it's just there. And to my mind, the same is true about moral knowledge. It's there. We can't necessarily establish, in a way that won't be subject to criticism, what the there is. But my argument is it's there. And that's what that's why I won't say more, I'll stop there. So I know we've had this argument before, but I do really think innateness, maybe that's the phrase, the word I want to use. And I'm not uncomfortable with saying that's just part of what it is to be a member of the human species.
That's a divergence, not just from me.
I've said before, I am a Deweyan about some things, but about that, not Deweyan at all. And I eliminated some of the things I had in each version. I sent a version of my comments to the panelists. I had a lot more about that in the early. And I don't feel I need to say it all the time, but I do believe that it is true. So.
Yeah, actually, that
Oh, am I good now? Much hinges on being able to distinguish between, on the one hand, having 2 different interpretations of the same concept and having 2 different concepts. And what that looks like is not completely clear to me. But that point aside, on the issue of the historiographers, I'd have thought that you would, given your views, about affected ignorance. Like, I thought you'd be very skeptical of the historians who would come along and say, these people were different culture, different times. I mean, and the argumentation of field work in familiar places, your critique of certain versions of moral relativism. I'd have thought you'd be that given that body of science that you would be. I mean, I know people say these things.
It's entirely consistent. The interpretations differ, but they're interpretations of the same concept. I've never not defended that.
Well, that's the first point. But I really wanted to ask you more about the second point, which is the historiography. That's to say, the effect that I was referring to your response to my comments in Business on Du Bois, and I thought that, and your skepticism regarding the historians who will come and say, "Gee, these people were, of a different time and place, so we can't really know, and we're likely to find out is that they just had, different views than we have." So that it seemed to me that you were, I was surprised to hear you conceding so much to such historians, given your views about effective ignorance, and given, your critique of moral relativism and fieldwork and engagement with anthropological literature, fieldwork in familiar places, that you would want to, respond strongly to those historians and then take up a kind of, a social scientific inquiry that really, tried to make a case about it.
So, Bob, I can say that historians are prone to say X without saying I think they're right. I don't think they're right. And in fact, if I were writing history, it would be moral history of the very kind you described. I have no reluctance to do that, to talk about the motivations of slave owners, and that there could be guilty of self-deception and affected ignorance. I have no hesitation. My argument was simply the challenge of that we would face with somebody trying to adopt the Du Bois style conception of history is that there's a very large percentage of historians who would say, "Oh, that's not history."
Right.
It might be interesting, but it's something other than history, in part because we're still attributing motives to people who are not standing in front of us. And the effort of making that attribution might be the readiness to make that attribution might be something that it would be hard to defend. This is a constant worry we have. And I'm told, "Oh, gee, I'm being unfair. I'm attributing motives when I talk about affected ignorance." I have no hesitation in saying, in fact, this goes back to Philip's question. You asked me where I would stop. Here's the problem. The people who think they're new moral ideas, they are willing to stop wherever it is convenient for them to stop. So, Aristotle lived so long ago, and he couldn't possibly have understood that slavery was wrong, and nobody had the moral resources. But the interesting thing, of course, Aristotle knew that there were people who thought that slavery was wrong, and that's why he makes such a project in the politics of trying to defend the idea that some people are naturally slaves. And the challenge is the people who don't want to defend the sort of moral and objective view I defend, they will, whenever it suits them, they'll say, "Well, 10 years ago, people thought differently, so you can't hold them responsible." I think the onus is on the people who make that argument and not on me. I just say it's constitutive of the species. Whenever the species began, maybe the Neanderthals went that way, but whenever the species really began, for my mind, what was part of the furniture of the mind was a certain capacity to use, understand, manipulate, interpret, apply a stock set of moral concepts.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know where to begin. Mike might have new questions now. Let me just first say that what you're doing in this work, I think it's interesting that we're having this kind of conversation right now about the type of work that you're doing. Particularly the kind of first order kind of conversation that we're having, given that a work that is so pointing us to various kinds of practices, as they say, on the ground. Now, I think why I like what you're doing, especially, is because, you got social justice being bandied about everywhere. Social justice, social justice, justice. You got Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 100 companies talking about justice. Anybody see the irony, the paradox, complications? Maybe all right. So So we need a conversation. Honestly, we do need to sort of think seriously about justice. Like I think especially right now, because I think a lot has been taken for granted about what we might mean by justice, at least in my view. So your work, I think, is intervening, giving us sort of to sort of allow us and invite us to to think again about our analytics around justice. And so along those lines, I think I'm interested in sort of maybe a sort of cynical sort of like how you sort of respond to the cynic in this way. And you have some, and I haven't read the book, so I must confess, but I'm curious to see whether or not it's taken up or whether or not you have any thoughts about it. I mean, I think a claim could be made that certain social movements, and let's just say around Black Lives Matter, hasn't produced very much. And in some ways not very interesting politically, and maybe even morally. We look around and see some of the folks who are associated as being sort of, the founders. We may not find many, or the types at least, of moral exemplars that we might be looking for. So how does one's conception of justice with those particular actors, what kind of conception of justice do you get out of that? And I think we can't look away from that if we're going to take justice seriously right now. Not saying that's what you're doing. I just think to have a conversation about social movements without also sort of confronting, because we might be at the very end of some stuff right now. Who knows? But could be, maybe not. We need some movements that actually have some credible, maybe moral bearings. So at least the types of moral practices that we would not quickly sort of turn a frown at. So I'm just wondering, like, given how social movements are themselves not entirely, but some just so embroiled, not just in terms of certain kinds of moral affairs, but also I think, and I want to sort of lift this thread up as high as I can, embroiled and sort of ensconced, entangled with capitalism. Yeah, so
Because your question's getting bigger and bigger. So let me say this. Social movements are sometimes most successful at changing practices, sometimes most successful at changing beliefs, and sometimes there's a group of them that change beliefs and practices at the same time. I'm ready to say that there's progress in any of those three possibilities. And I would argue that Black Lives Matter, given that it ended up producing one of the absolute largest social protests in American history, I forget which day in June this was, hundreds of thousands of people on one day, leave aside the global protest. The very fact that the phrase Black Lives Matter stopped making everybody afraid and stopped making everybody unaware of what some elements of that claim are about, to my mind, is progress. Have they stopped police brutality as a consequence of that? No, but you know what they've done? That's why I mentioned the George Floyd case. It's not that the fact that the murder of George Floyd is held guilty of murder that is somehow the most important thing. It's that it opens the door to the idea that the police are not simply able to do what they do without some kind of accountability. That's, to my mind, given how long it's taken, and of course there will be other cases like that, I consider that progress. Second thing I would say is that not every social movement can be expected to make the same amount of change in societies that other movements have made. The civil rights movement really is anomalous in this way, in that even though there are limitations, even King himself would have said this in 1965, but the kind of change that was brought about in the classic phase, if you ask me, there will never be another movement, I think, that has quite that, the degree of power that it had, partly because there was less diffusion in the media. So people would concentrate the photojournalistic images on the harm being done to the protesters. That's never going to happen again. When it does happen, it might be more incremental. But I'll give my last example. Catherine McKinnon is adamant that people complained about the women writing their stories on Twitter that Me Too, at Me Too. She said, look, this is a case where each person making a contribution to this very incredible narrative that turns out to be far more commonly experienced than people thought. She called it butterfly politics. And she says that maybe from these small actions, it is possible for extraordinarily profound consequences to flow, but it takes a long time. It may be that in the current moment, as I said, part of it is the dispersal really of our attention and the very the diffusion, if you will, of media power. Our attention is split in ways it wouldn't have been in 1964 or 65. And social movements will operate differently because of that. And the change will have to be measured by different standards. Yes. I'm a little surprised by the Platonism of your position. I don't know what to call it. And I'm going to push against this via Chomsky, because Chomsky argues about the universality of syntax, that every human child will be able to build a grammatically adequate sentence in some natural language, right? But Chomsky does not believe in universal semantics. I think that's where the theory stopped. And so this brings me to the question of whether, in fact, moral change and moral language is not about semantics. Rather, you seem to be saying, of course, there is a concept of equality. Of course, there is a concept of justice. And, all we need to do is point out, to Euthyphro that, included in this concept of justice should also be, those barbarians, the Persians, whose language they didn't understand. They didn't have a sense of color for them. People were different in terms of their languages and so on. But I don't get that. I don't get that. And I find that your own work, I find that this book is really operating at the level of transformations of semantic meaning and I found the whole concept of narrative transformation so compelling. And I like it so much, but now I'm a little confused. I mean, Bob said, well, conception, that's a little too easy.
I didn't say concept conception. I said the difference between saying we have two different interpretations of one concept and saying that we have two concepts.
Right.
That's and what's the difference between saying those two things?
Right, but I mean, that distinction between concept and conception is established in the literature. So Michele could go back to that and say, well, there is a concept of justice that is species specific. And what happens in the development of history is, variations. And I don't know why you want to say that. I don't know why you are so committed to that.
It's about commonality across different cultures, amongst different people within a single culture. I actually think, and you call it Platonic, I call it Socratic, because I don't claim that it's somehow a knowledge of something independent of human experience, like a knowledge of the form of the good or it's a Socratic confidence that when you have an argument that's meant to be about morality, you can eventually, unless the person leaves the way Euthyphro leaves before the trial, right? That you can eventually draw them into a conversation that they can understand as a conversation about morality. I make this argument about anthropologists going to unfamiliar cultures and claiming, oh, they're so different from us. But in the end, they'll say, well, don't worry. The reason you shouldn't feel bad about the West African people who might have accepted polygamy is that it's just another way of caring for children. And you agree that caring for your children is a good thing, don't you? And we nod. And my argument is that this makes sense of the commonality that is revealed in those moments when we can look at somebody whose life is very different from ours. And we can, if we're thoughtful, we can dig down, down into something we share. And I think, to me, I actually think that having a conversation with somebody you disagree with in your own culture is a little bit like a kind of ethnographic experience, where what you're trying to do is dig down to find, this to me is this debate between people who are pro-choice and those who are, anti-choice, or pro-life and pro-abort, whatever the framing you want. That to my mind, in the end, it will take moral imagination for people to find new interpretations of the concepts they have in common that allow them to find common ground. I don't claim right now to know, in the most horrible disagreements we have, what that common ground would look like or where the imagination would take us.
One last question from the audience.
Okay, thank you for talking. I really enjoyed this. And my question is, in Rawls's attempt to formalize some of the same social movements that you talk about in the book, including King's, he says explicitly that the reason King was so successful is because he had this excellent understanding of political ideologies in the American Constitution. And I think that most people who are familiar with King recognize that there was a lot more that went into his motivation and a lot more that went into the reason his movement was able to affect so many people. But some of those elements are not as rational as a political understanding of the Constitution, including appeals to religion or things like that. So in justifiable social movements that involve civil disobedience, where do you think, like Rawls thought, that and a sophisticated rational understanding of political ideals is necessary for those to be successful? And if not, can you substitute that with non-rational appeals to religion or some other ideology?
So I want to be frank and do two things. I think I'll continue to accept your characterization of non-rational, but I'll point out that it's not the same as irrational. Yeah. Secondly, King was adamant, actually in writings and in sermons and so forth, that there was a need for forms of persuasion, for forms of interaction with people who supported oppressive structures that could not be successfully carried out by discursive rational argument alone. He was adamant, and he didn't think it was just about religious faith. He thought it was about so this is why he so artfully sort of draws on journalism, video, photographs, to vividly depict the image of nonviolent protesters standing and being willing to be beaten and set upon with dogs, etc. He was appealing, I would argue, there to sympathetic imagination. One of the four kinds of imagination I talk. And I don't want to say, I don't want to resist the idea that it's non-rational all the time. In the discussion I have about Richard Posner, the legal theorist, I realized this morning, I reread that chapter. I thought maybe I'm conceding too much, because I actually think that it is not non-rational to sometimes want to show someone something that we cannot effectively say by means of a discursive argument. You can talk until you're, as my parents might say, until you're blue in the face. And sometimes the only thing that works when it comes to the facts of injustice is showing what it means to be subject. I think that's why slave narratives had the effect they did. It didn't affect everybody, but the power of showing is, to my mind, critical to these movements working. You can understand rational arguments about the nature of political life, etc., till the cows come home. But if you don't understand the power of imaginative sort of sympathizing with someone's plight, you are not, in some instances, going to affect social change. And of course, King did sometimes think it was about religious belief, but it didn't have to be a particular religion. It was religion showing something that transcended the things you're able to describe in language.
Yeah, and showing what it means may also be listening to Nina Simone singing "I Wonder What It's Like to Be Free." This is a dimension. This is
Bill Collins.
Yep. Yeah. We have to stop. We can talk informally, but we can. Okay. So yeah, we do have to stop now. But thank,
Stop there.
yeah, we can talk informally. Thank you very much to all our panelists.